All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. I hope you guys had a wonderful 3-day weekend. I know that for us, we were able to take some time, go outside and enjoy the weather. And here is today's roadmap for you all. In the chat function, you can see what we will be looking at in today's class. First, we have a warm-up question. We're going to be ending the Civil War. So coming into a close of the Civil War. And then we have the preview for next week, and looking at, I should say preview for this week, and then looking at what we have for next week. So for today, here's our warm-up question. Go ahead and look at the screen, and using your chat function, go ahead and respond to the following question. Taking some time to look at the warm-up question for today. And in the chat function, hopefully you responded to our question. Again, this is easy participation points. There are multiple ways of participation. This is one of those. And it looks like majority of you got it correct. Good job, Vice President. Now, interestingly enough, the follow-up question, if the president is taken out and no longer capable of leadership abilities, and there's no vice president, who would then take over after that? Because that's happened. Any guesses? Who the next in line? If it's the president's no longer capable of doing it, the vice president is no longer capable of doing it. Yes, Anthony Q, Desire, absolutely, very good. Yes, Anna, very good. So yeah, we've actually had that instance where there was not necessarily a vice president in line because the president at the time died of natural causes. So the vice president came in, and then the vice president was then removed or almost impeached. And we had that situation where there was an impeachment. So the speaker of the House would then be the third option. If you've ever seen on Netflix, there is a great show with Kiefer Sutherland called Designated Survivor. Oh, it's great. If you haven't seen it, check it out. Kiefer Sutherland's the guy off of 24. Basically, he is the last man to survive an attempt upon the United States, and he becomes president. And I forget his role at the time, but he was in line for secession, and he becomes president of the United States. So it's very cool. Great show. Put that one on the list to check out. It's very good. All right, so our warm-up question, the reason I had that question is because if you look to your left on that little screen, we have President Lincoln. And we all know President Lincoln, something big happens in his presidency. He grows a beard. No, something else does well. But we will see kind of what happens with his presidency with the end of the Civil War. And then I have a preview for the rest of the week, so that way you guys can be up to date and kind of see what we're doing for the week. So let's get started, shall we? So we are going with the end of the Civil War. If you recall, on Friday's class, you guys did a little trading cards. You submitted the trading cards from Thursday's class and Friday's class, where you had to pick 5 Civil War events. And these events were made into kind of like a trading card or a kind of like a baseball card. And you were to then find out the date of when it happened, as well as where it happened and the significance of that. So if you recall, that's what we did in Friday's class. You also did a video, and there was a couple quick questions, a Google survey that you had to fill out from Friday's class. So today we're going to be looking at the end of the Civil War. We're wrapping up the Civil War. And we start off with a gentleman by the name of William Tecumseh Sherman. And William Tecumseh Sherman is famous for being a gentleman who leads what is called the March to the Sea. In approximately March of 1864, Grant would then become the commanding officer of the Union armies, and he would then appoint General Sherman to round into the South and use his tactics to cause the South to have a total war, meaning they were using all of their resources possible. And it was one of those instances where he was lighting a flame or burning everything in sight while he was making his trek through the South. And a big importance of this, we start to see what is called a scorched earth policy. If you recall from the American Revolutionary War, there was a battle tactic. Anyone recall what that battle tactic was used by the Patriots from that time? If you do, just type it in the little chat function. The battle tactic that the American Revolutionary War, what did they use? Here in the Civil War, we have scorched earth policy called total war. Boom, yes, very good. Yeah, it's called the guerrilla warfare in the American Revolutionary War. That was a recall. The guerrilla warfare, that is where they start to divide up and there's no real logistics to their fighting. Well, in this instance, in the Civil War, we have Sherman, and Sherman would use all of his resources then to go out and fight. And he would actually go out and burn everything in sight. In fact, while he was doing that, he was closing in upon one of the big communication hubs of the South, and that was Atlanta, Georgia. And in Atlanta, Georgia, the Confederate soldiers made one last stand in the South. And there's a famous hill, if you've ever driven through Georgia and if you've ever seen the South, but there's a high point, and the Confederates were up on the high point of Atlanta, and they were looking down upon Sherman as Sherman and his men were closing in on the offensives of Atlanta, and they were burning everything in its path. Sherman also, while making its trek through Georgia, takes over Savannah, Georgia, where he then inflicts more damage upon the Confederates, especially in the South. And as Sherman is making his way, he is freeing the slaves. And so the slaves that were part of the South are now joining his troops, and they are helping in Sherman's march. And they are actually wanting to help Sherman by giving up information about the Confederates and giving that to the soldiers as far as the Union soldiers. And I have a clip here that will show you a little bit about Sherman's March to the Sea. This is from the hit series America's Story of Us, and this shows a little bit about his movement towards the sea. It's only about 3 minutes long.
Lincoln puts the North's entire industrial might behind one final push. The man who will lead the charge from Chattanooga to Atlanta, William Sherman. His orders: to stop for nothing.
I would make this war as severe as possible and show no symptoms of tiring till the South begs for mercy.
Advancing under the cover of night, Sherman's march is sustained by one of the greatest logistical operations yet seen in this conflict. Sherman knows he needs to throw everything he's got at the Confederate Army. While he uses his own supply lines to maximum effect, he destroys those of the South, ripping up their railroad and bending it beyond use. In one day, the North's supply lines replaced 200,000 bullets. While the South is left scavenging on the battlefield for spent rounds, food, even old boots. Sherman calls it total war, a scorched earth approach that becomes the trademark of modern warfare. Finally, with Atlanta under siege, Confederate forces set fire to their own munition stores before abandoning their city to the Union soldiers. Sherman's tactics of total war have won out. His victory helped secure Lincoln's election in the fall. With Atlanta in ruins, he just keeps going, now launching what will be his final assault, the March to the Sea. In the 19th century equivalent of shock and awe, 62,000 Union soldiers wreak a 60-mile wide path of destruction across Georgia. From Atlanta to the coast at Savannah. Supply lines are cut, villages are sacked, and crops torched. Anything of military value is destroyed.
All right, so you can kind of see in that little clip there a little bit about the scorched earth policy. And how Sherman was the one who was in charge of that, and how he kind of comes in play, and he factors in, okay, we are going to take control of all of its resources, including the rail lines. In fact, they would actually call these Sherman's neckties because they kind of look like a old school necktie. And what they would do, William Tecumseh Sherman would go out and he would have his men burn or melt the iron of the railroad tile and then have it bend. So it was kind of like if you've ever taken a hanger, and if you've ever bent the hanger, it's very difficult for a metal hanger to be back to straightened. Well, that's what he was doing all throughout the South, because the South would then no longer be able to have transportation or any type of rail lines or ways of communication. So you see these images here of what the South kind of looked like after Sherman and his men were going into the South and destroying everything in sight. Here's a picture as well, a little bit closer, of Sherman on his horseback, looking out to Atlanta as they burn through Atlanta. And you notice in the foreground or up close, some of the freed slaves as they are joining his side, or they are basically looking at him almost as a savior in freeing them as the Union soldiers were going through and helping them. William Tecumseh Sherman would be one of the vital generals later on who would also have a political role in that he would help Abraham Lincoln eventually win the election of 1864. Meanwhile, Grant, as he was taking his men, he was approaching from a different perspective, and that was from the north. And he was going from Richmond from the west. And as he was going through that, he was actually encircling the Confederates. And on April the 9th, 1865, we have the famous surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Interesting side note, the gentleman who actually owned the courthouse did not want anything to deal with war. In fact, historically, the gentleman who owned this Appomattox Courthouse, like a house, the plantation house, he actually fled from where Manassas was, and that was the first Battle of Bull Run. He flees that and he says, I don't want anything to do with war or conflict, and he makes his establishment there in Virginia in this area of Appomattox. And sure enough, this is where it would be surrendered as far as the war itself. There were several different soldiers actually at the house, and when they come into the house, they actually start taking memorabilia like trophies, things like silverware, things like the chairs, things like the wallpaper, and they were keeping those as memorabilia, saying that they were actually at the courthouse where the surrender of the Civil War took place. And so this gentleman who happened to be at his location is unfortunate because his house basically gets destroyed, but at the same time, it's historically relevant because that's where it was the surrender of the Civil War on April the 9th, 1865. Now, a couple things with the surrender to take note of. The Confederate soldiers, they would not be prosecuted for treason. So when Grant and Lee met at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865, they said, we will not prosecute you for treason, because the main goal for President Lincoln was to unify the North and the South. Later on, he would then switch his role and he would say, my main goal was to end slavery for all and to establish the 13th Amendment, which would ban slavery. Another term of agreement is that the cavalry and infantry would be able to keep their horses. And big significance for that, as they are transporting back to their locations, their homes, they needed those horses for the plantations, for the farming, for growing crops. And so the North wanted to help, again, kind of allow them to find some livelihood to be able to keep those horses and be able to establish that. The third term of agreements is that they would provide 3 days worth of rations to the Confederate soldiers to allow for them to be able to make it back to their home location safely. So those are some of the terms of agreement. Now again, on April 9th, 1865, We have General Robert E. Lee surrendering to Ulysses S. Grant. And that was significant again because that would be the ending point for the Civil War. Flashing back just 1 year prior to that, we have the election of 1864. And I have this slide in here purposely because many of the Southerners were starting to plot a coup against President Lincoln, to the point where they were actually going to try to kidnap and hold President Lincoln for ransom. So in the election of 1864, President Lincoln strategizes, and he would attract a Democratic representative who was from Tennessee, which Tennessee, by the way, at that time was one of the Confederate states, and that was by the name of Andrew Johnson. He would become the vice president. Lincoln would actually defeat one of his former generals, General McClellan. General McClellan at the time was regarded as someone who had 10,000 bodyguards. And the reason they called him the man with 10,000 bodyguards is because he was not very active in the war itself, and he tended to stay put. And so McClellan would lose to Lincoln. And after the election, this is important, Lincoln would write up the 13th Amendment, which would ban slavery in the United States. That would not get ratified until the Reconstruction era. And we'll look at the Reconstruction era in the next couple classes, because there are two other amendments that are of key importance during this time. And here are the election results. You can see the red states representing the states that went to President Lincoln. The green states representing the states that went to McClellan. Now, again, the South, they did not have representation because they seceded and they made their own Confederate States of America. And so that's why you have Virginia all the way to Texas not participating in the 1864 election. Another key thing from this, General Sherman has his men go back into the North to then vote so that President Lincoln would be victorious, because a lot of these men, again, were of voting age and they could vote. And so if they had not gone back to their home state for that voting period, it may have looked a lot closer in this wartime elections. And who knows, maybe possibly McClellan could have possibly won. And if you look closely, just below Indiana, you have Kentucky. They're going to a Democratic, McClellan. And then below that, you have Tennessee. Now, again, the representative, the vice president, is from Tennessee. And if you recall, he was a Democrat. Lincoln was a Republican. So interestingly enough, we have two people who are on opposite sides as far as political sides, yet representing the executive office of the United States. President Lincoln being a Republican, Andrew Johnson being that a Democrat. That would be tall tale sign. If that were to happen today, what would happen would be crazy outcry if we had a Republican president and a Democrat vice president, or vice versa, in today's society. Now, President Lincoln, approximately 5 days after the surrender, President Lincoln goes to view a play. And this play happens to be at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. While during the play, a gentleman by the name of John Wilkes Booth steps out from the crowd and he fires a bullet into the back of President Lincoln's head. And interestingly enough, John Wilkes Booth was a famous actor, or a hopeful famous actor. He actually timed it up to where the crowd made a lot of noise, like an applause. And as the crowd is making this applause, he fires his gun, and people can't necessarily hear the gun go off from in the crowd noise because, again, they're watching the play. So here is John Wilkes Booth. He would actually jump from the second-story banister where President Lincoln was sitting. His foot, his spur of his boot would get caught on one of the decorations, and he would land awkwardly onto the stage. People were starting to wonder, who in the world is this person? They were starting to think, okay, this is part of the play. This is kind of strange. And as he is walking off the stage, John Wilkes Booth would turn to the crowd and he would yell out, "Sic semper tyrannius," which stands for "thus always with tyrants." There would be a bounty for John Wilkes Booth's head, and there would be a $100,000 reward. You will notice that on that reward sign, there are other people that are a part of it. And yes, there is a conspiracy that John Wilkes Booth had teamed up with several other people to not only kidnap or kill President Lincoln, but also kidnap the Vice President, Andrew Johnson, and kidnap/kill the Secretary of State, Edwin Stanton. And they were going to hold those three people for ransom so that the North would then have to surrender to the South. And here's kind of an artist rendition of what happened at the play at Ford's Theater. Some of you may have actually been to Washington, D.C., may have seen actually Ford's Theater. You could still go there today. They now have a glass plexiglass kind of shield where you can walk up and see where President Lincoln was sitting. Now, remind you, they didn't have like the Secret Service back in the day. So President Lincoln was exposed to the public pretty easily. It wasn't something where there were police officers outside of his banister or outside of his doorway protecting him. It was more, you could easily access or kind of walk in and go right up to him. Now, I said there's some crazy coincidences out there. Some of you may have seen this, maybe not, but this is kind of cool. And I'm gonna show it real quick. But if you are one of those people who kind of follows conspiracy theories, conspiracy theories or coincidences, these are some strange coincidences between Lincoln and JFK. If you know a little bit of history, JFK would be assassinated as well. Here are some crazy things, and you can read them yourself as I click through them. So if you are thinking about running for president in the year 2046, or I should say 2060, so in 40 years, if you guys are thinking about running for president, you may want to think of a different year because Lincoln was elected in 1860 and JFK was elected in 1960. Some other crazy coincidences. Both are killed by a conspiracy. Booth was trying to kidnap him. And then Lee Harvey Oswald, the gentleman who shot and killed Kennedy, supposedly was hired by the mob or the mafia. And he was supposedly killed himself, shot himself. There's some great conspiracies out there, coincidences. Get this, Lincoln was shot in a Ford Theater. JFK was shot in a Ford Lincoln. Woo. Crazy, crazy. Lincoln's secretary names was Kennedy. JFK's secretary was named Lincoln. Both of them were assassinated by Southerners. Oh, both of the vice president's last name was Johnson. You got Andrew Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson. Pretty eerie, pretty scary. John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth. Some other crazy coincidences. John Wilkes Booth was born in 1839. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in 1939. Both of the assassins' names comprise of at least 15 letters. And then the other crazy kind of coincidence, Booth, who killed Lincoln, was in a theater, and he runs and he gets caught in a warehouse. Oswald, who was in a warehouse, when he shot President Kennedy, he was then fleeing, and he would be caught in a movie theater just outside of Dallas, Texas. So pretty crazy. Crazy, crazy. So finally, the last little bit as we finish up. Lincoln's assassination. Two major things from it that we've learned or that we now have to move forward with are how to restore Southern states, and then how to integrate over 4 million new freed African Americans. So this is now our country. We have just finished a war where approximately 600,000 men have died, more than any other war in America combined. And we have our vice president, who's now the president of the United States, is in charge, who does not necessarily know what's to do as far as rekindling or bringing back the South and restoring the Southern states. So he, President Johnson, will now have to figure out what is the choices, the options that they will do. Now, some of the costs of the war, we have over 600,000, like I mentioned, were dead, killed. One soldier for every 4 slaves would become free. And then over $3 billion. This would be something that would take over 20 years for it to then pay back. So this is one of the costlier things that we start to see, and we'll look at tomorrow. You guys are going to look at the Reconstruction and how the Reconstruction played a factor, especially in President Johnson's presidency. All right.